Hi, I'm Will Kiblinger. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and a long-term member of the Safe Zones Advisory Group. In this video, I plan to discuss the Bible and its uses or misuses in justifying homophobia, the aversion and contempt expressed towards the LGBT community. I think the main question is, what exactly does the Bible say about homosexuality? Does it really say it's a sin? It's a good line. However, I would say that the Bible never really admonishes homosexuals per se. That word does not appear in the Bible at all and is, in fact, a rather modern invention from the late 19th century. It didn't occur in any English translation of the Bible until 1946. Moreover, when we use the word today, we might think of sexual orientation that is built into someone's identity and personality. We might also talk about same-sex relationships, as we hear about in the news regarding gay marriage. Neither of those ideas appears in the Bible. There is certainly no discussion of sexual orientation, which may not be too surprising since our understanding of it has developed significantly in the last few decades. More surprisingly, perhaps, marriage in the Bible is generally not treated as a relationship. To understand that, we have to understand that in the ancient cultures of the Bible, ancient Israel and the Greco-Roman world, marriage was a property right. Wives and children were legally the property of the husband and father. To give you an idea of how foreign this understanding is to us, think of the story of Onan in Genesis. Onan gets in trouble because he, quote-unquote, spills his seed on the ground. Many readers have assumed the sin involved was masturbation. But if you read the story and understand its cultural setting, you'll see that it wasn't that. Onan's brother had died without leaving any children. And as an ancient Israelite, it was Onan's duty as brother-in-law to impregnate his brother's widow so that his brother's line might continue. Onan knew the offspring wouldn't be his, and so out of spite, he refused to fulfill his duty and wasted his seed instead. Now, think about what this story says about marriage. First of all, the widow has no voice in this law at all. She is merely property and subject to the law of the men. Secondly, this widow and brother-in-law are to bear a child as a duty, regardless of how they may feel about that. That's an awkward relationship at best. When we think of marriage as a relationship, we mean a kind of partnership between equals. Each person has a voice, has feelings that matter, and has a legitimate perspective. Relationship is a term for a non-hierarchical partnership, rather than a property relation in which one person is subordinate to another. So, in most places, the Bible does not really depict heterosexual or homosexual relationships in its stories. For the most part, what we get are reflections of the ancient cultures in which the stories are told. And in those cultures, we really only find property relations, not relationships. I say that's true in most places in the Bible because there are some suggestions here and there, especially in Paul's letters and in the Gospels, but also early on in the Song of Songs, that human couples might aspire to have more than a property relation, that they might share a mutual love based on respect and equality. Some people might interject at this point to note that Paul says something about wives being subject to their husbands. That's in Ephesians 5. That just sounds like the same old property relation idea. However, it's important to read the whole passage. What was radical for its day was the suggestion that it goes both ways. Paul says for a couple to be subject to one another, and that includes husbands to their wives. So there are some parts of the Bible that break the mold of the ancient world and recommend a new kind of relationship instead of just a property relation. Still, when it comes to claims about homosexuality, There is no discussion of what we now mean by a same-sex relationship between consenting, mature, loving adults. That idea simply had no place in those cultures as far as the Bible reports of them. So we may ask, why do some people so resolutely claim that the Bible condemns homosexuality? There are a handful of passages that, when translated in a certain way and then interpreted in a certain way, can be construed to do that. Let's run through those typical passages and see what's wrong with these translations and interpretations. To take them in the order they occur in the Bible, we'll start at the beginning with the Garden of Eden. I'll just paraphrase the argument. The Genesis story is about Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It's a catchy line, but that's about all that can be said for it. My first point is that there's a logical fallacy involved. Heterosexuality may be the most common form of sexuality, but it does not follow that it is the only form of appropriate sexuality. Because the story does not mention same-sex relations, it cannot be inferred that they are wrong. It does not refer to friendship, but we would not infer that friendship is wrong. The second point that I would like to raise to counter the justification of homophobia using this passage is the following, that for Christians, it does not fit with what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. In its context, Jesus means that our moral rules should be judged by the good fruit that they bear. Is it good fruit to prohibit a loving relationship and to produce a loveless, solitary life? The next typical passage one hears is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I won't quote the whole story, but I'll assume a general knowledge of it in Genesis 19. It's often used to justify homophobia by saying something like the following, that the men of Sodom asked to know the visiting men or angels, meaning that they wanted to engage in homosexual intercourse with them. The city is then destroyed for its wickedness. Thus, homosexuality is wicked and homosexuals should be destroyed. To counter this line of argument, I would first note that we need to read the story in its entirety. In the story, their wickedness predates what happens with the visitors. The plan to destroy the city for some kind of wickedness was formed by God before the angels visit the town. And then it is destroyed as planned, not because of this request of the men of Sodom. And the second point I'd like to make about this story is that of the multiple references to this story elsewhere in the Old Testament and New Testament, no text claims that homosexuality, as the term is used now, constituted the crime committed in Sodom and Gomorrah. In Ezekiel, Sodom's sins are described as pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, and not aiding the poor and needy. In Isaiah, we are told that Sodom's sins are vain sacrifices and general iniquity. Jeremiah cites adultery and lies. The apocryphal book Sirach cites arrogance, and another apocryphal book, Wisdom of Solomon, notes wickedness and inhospitality. In the Gospels Matthew and Luke, Jesus is under the impression that Sodom was destroyed because of inhospitality. Note that that word inhospitality may seem weak here. After all, the townspeople seem to ask for the angels in order to gang rape them, pardon the inelegant term. As such, a strong condemnation does seem required. In sum, nowhere in the Old Testament or New Testament is the sin of Sodom, which caused its destruction, equated with homosexuals or homosexuality. The wickedness refers to their quote-unquote inhospitality, as evidenced by their intent to rape and murder. This brings us to the most direct sounding statement in the Old Testament, two passages from Leviticus 18 and 20. as a justification for homophobia, these statements seem clear as condemnations of homosexuality. However, I think we need to learn more about the context. These statements are clear, but their context and application are not. They are part of the Holiness Code, which is designed to provide a standard of purity that will distinguish the Jews from the Canaanites. The price for the Promised Land is this code of conduct, lest the land vomit out the Israelites as it had prior inhabitants. The sentence for violations is death. Death for adultery, death for incest, death for children who curse their parents. Thus, these rules were designed for the purpose of nation building. Other rules included keeping the Sabbath, showing hospitality, forbidding the inbreeding of cattle or the sowing of fields with two kinds of seeds, forbidding the use of garments made of two kinds of material. Round haircuts are forbidden, as are tattoos, or consultations with mediums or wizards. A man may not have sexual relations with his wife while she menstruates. A man must procreate with the widow of his deceased brother, as we've heard. Violations of these rules are condemned because they defy purity and weaken the cultural identification of the children of Israel. Thus, we can understand the context: cultural identity, protection, and procreation. In this context, male-male intercourse is a risk to all three. It resembles the identity of the Canaanites, who apparently practiced male prostitution in fertility cults. It threatens their unity as a group, and thus their protection from enemies, and it negates the procreation which the new nation desperately needed. Is this context the same as our context? Not at all. To this, I would add one more point about the word abomination. Male-male intercourse, according to Leviticus, is ritually impure, not intrinsically or morally wrong. When the term abomination is used, it frequently has to do with ritual impurity, and that refers to whatever the Gentiles do. Like round haircuts or intercourse during menstruation, it is an abomination because Gentiles are known for it, or it is simply felt to be impure, not because it's intrinsically wrong. Leviticus also contains other sexual prohibitions: adultery, incest, and bestiality. And those appear elsewhere in the Bible, for example, in the Ten Commandments, and elsewhere in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, etc. However, there is no further mention of male-male intercourse anywhere in the Old Testament. Thus, the quote-unquote abomination of male-male intercourse does not have moral significance, like those other prohibitions of adultery, incest, and bestiality. We might look at it this way, that when purity concerns and morality concerns are involved, we have the strong condemnation of adultery, incest, and bestiality. But when purity concerns alone are involved, we only find examples of things like male-male sexual conduct, intercourse during menstruation, and masturbation. One final point on all this. Whatever this passage is referring to, it is not a same-sex relationship, i.e. a non-hierarchical and long-lasting bond between consenting adults. No such concept existed. So that's it for the Old Testament. Now let's turn to the New Testament. Jesus never mentions the subject, so we only have a couple of lines from Paul to consider. And really, once we deal with the main passage in Romans, we will have addressed all there is to say about the other two minor references. So, the passage in question is Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. This passage is often used as a justification for homophobia, where the argument goes something like this. When Paul condemns these dishonorable passions and shameless acts as unnatural, he is referring to all same-sex partnerships and is establishing a norm that is valid in all times and places. To this I have several rebuttals. The first of which is that the sin here is idolatry, a kind of self-worshiping. It's not about homosexuality. Paul writes about the fallen nature of humankind, the corrupted will, as St. Augustine refers to it. The context of this passage describes those whose corrupted wills have led them to a total self-absorption and self-deception. They now worship themselves rather than God. The sin here is idolatry. Paul's point is that they will reap the consequences of worshiping these lesser, inferior gods. Thus, in the verses right before, 24 and 25, Paul writes, "Therefore God gave them up in their lusts of their hearts to impurity, and to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator." He goes on to describe these self-worshiping fallen ones as, quote unquote, "filled with murder, strife, deceit, malignity. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless." This is the context of the passage in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And Paul never mentions homosexuality anywhere else. Thus, he is not writing about homosexuality as such, neither as he would understand it, nor as we would now. I have another point to make here about the dishonorable passions. When Paul discusses the quote-unquote dishonorable passions, he is referring to passions out of control. They are a disordering of God's purpose because these passions become an end in themselves and are thus idolatrous. One more point about the language. The quote unnatural unquote behavior involves a heterosexual engaging in homosexual acts because of an arrogant willfulness to disrupt the ordering of emotions that this person knows to befit him or her. Paul does not discuss gay persons or people of differing sexual orientation, but only heterosexual persons who behave like homosexuals. He has no concept of homosexual identity or orientation. One more thing. Nature, in Paul's vocabulary, does not refer to the theory of natural law, that's a later invention, nor to the order created by God. Nature merely means customary or characteristic. That is, it is not to be confused with that which is innate, inherent, or immutable. One might look at the 1 Corinthians chapter 11 passage when Paul writes, "Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but if that a woman has long hair, it is her glory?" Here, Paul clearly means that hair length standards are cultural customs. By biological nature, a man's hair grows long, but that was not the custom in Rome. Homosexual activity was not customary among Jews in Paul's era, but it was quite customary and common in the Greco-Roman world in the form of pederasty and male prostitution. Thus, nature is not a moral force in Paul's terminology, just a description of cultural forms and habits in the Roman world. One more thing, the shameless acts. The shameless acts of which Paul speaks are acts involving lust and avarice, an act of the will, and an unavoidable degree of exploitation where the stronger took advantage of the weaker. Such exploitation was common and natural in the context of male dominance and female passivity in Paul's era. But with same-sex unions, it was shameless because it usually involved pederasty, the adult male exploiting for sexual purposes the younger, weaker male. All Paul knew of homosexuality would have been pederasty and male prostitution, i.e. the debauched pagan expressions of homosexuality. Likewise, in a couple of other passages, in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, the reference to sodomites sometimes has been translated recently as homosexuals. It comes from the Greek term arsenokoitai, which literally means male beds, a combination of words. It's a strange term that Paul seems to have coined and doesn't use very often, and we don't see it elsewhere. So it's been a troubling term to translate. For most of Christian history, it was translated as male prostitutes. Only recently have we heard it translated as homosexuals. So that takes care of the other references that you might hear in the New Testament to homosexuality. This term is the term in question, and it often is mistranslated. That brings me to one final conclusion from this part on Paul. Condemning homosexuality, because Paul condemns the sexual indulgences of pederasty and prostitution, would be like condemning all drinking of wine because Paul condemns reckless drunkenness. So I come to my final conclusion of this video. Homosexuality is not a sin according to the Bible. The construal of it as such requires two principal misconceptions. One, that sexual orientation is a choice, and therefore it could be a sin. And two, that these biblical texts condemn what we mean by same-sex relationships. The test of any sexual ethics is its fruits, as we heard from Matthew 7. Does our moral code promote a good life? In Christian terms, a life of faith, hope, and love. If a purity code stands in the way, then it must be rejected. As Paul writes in Galatians 5, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Thank you very much.